So I'm very excited to welcome all of you. Folks who have come to this symposium in the past know that we do this on an annual basis, trying to pick hot topics to bring a variety of different kinds of perspectives to bear. So we want to get university researchers and scholars, policymakers, school personnel, anyone who has an interest and a stake in the topic, and try to bring evidence-based research and discussion to the topic. For the past few years, we've focused a lot on K-12 education and the things that are facing teachers and leaders in the schools today. But this year seemed a good opportunity to talk about higher education. And our topic, as you know, is finance and accountability. And the topic kind of grew out of a number of different trends, I think, that we've been witnessing in higher education. We've seen across many states declining state support for public education. I've been sort of monitoring the Chronicle of Higher Education, and there have been, throughout the summer since we decided on this topic and into the fall, varying reports, and I'll just mention a few. So in California, for example, the state system, the Cal State system, the UC system, the community college system, their state support has declined anywhere between 24 and 30% since 2008. In Colorado, their university system is down 27% in state support over the last 3 years. In Washington State and Pennsylvania, they're down more than 50%. Now in those states, the amount of state support, if you look at the percent of state support compared to the total budget in those universities, is relatively small to begin with. And I'm aware in states like Virginia that is a very small part of the state institution's budget at this point. In fact, we often hear people talk about universities that were at one time state supported, now they're state located, not so much state supported. And in Florida, we have seen a decline of over 25% of our state support in the last 3 to 4 years. At the same time, we have a number of conflicting state imperatives. So states are saying, graduate more students, but keep the costs low for students. We don't want to put this on the backs of students. And by the way, spend less state money while you're doing it. So how do the universities respond? In many cases by raising tuition, which then creates concern about access. Are we educating, or are we admitting students who can afford to pay the full freight? And in some cases, universities are making the decision to admit more students from out of state because they will pay more than the students from in-state. Or, and this is something that we've seen in community colleges in particular, I think, open access, but closed sections. So instead of students being able to get the courses they need in a timely way, it may take them longer to go through their college career. Faculty hours are being reduced, administrative and staff support are being trimmed, which can result in packed classrooms and fewer services to students. Another trend is increasing accountability, with particular focus on institutional outcomes. Chronicle of Higher Ed reported in an article recently that a 2010 law in Tennessee made it the first state to appropriate nearly all of its dollars for higher education based on outcomes such as credit completions and graduation rates. This raised concerns for some that this could result in lower standards, so pressure for faculty to make sure that students were making it through their classes. And yet it has also led to creative strategies, things like more focus on advising to make sure that students are getting the kinds of courses that would enable them to be successful in their college careers. It's also led to providing more support for at-risk students in credit-bearing classes rather than having them take non-credit remedial classes. So we have extremely complex issues with many factors in play, even raising a question of what it will mean for state universities to have a public mission if they are no longer deriving much or any of their funding from the states in which they're located. So this seemed like a particularly good time to grapple with some of these issues in a reasoned and evidence-based way, to enjoin the conversation among scholars of higher education, leaders of higher education. I particularly want to welcome, we have President Murdoch from Tallahassee Community College, President Bruder from DuPage College, and I don't know where President Bruder is sitting, over, oh, there we go, and former superintendent. So we're excited to have a variety of leaders and state leaders and staffers as well. It's always tempting to look at silver bullet solutions, but I think the issues are too complex for that. And so my hope is that today we will seek some consensus on more sustainable financial models that might balance fiscal needs with accountability. Before I introduce President Barron, who will kick us off this morning, I want to particularly thank our keynote speakers and panelists for taking time out of their very, very busy schedules to be here. I also want to thank our conference planning committee, which primarily is our higher ed faculty and our staff in our communications office. And finally, to thank all of you for coming out for what I think will be a thoughtful and provocative day, and hope that you will find it well worth your time to participate. So we're fortunate to have President Barron to help set the stage for the day. He has had a keen interest in this topic and has been a leader among university presidents, drafting a response to the Texas Accountability Plan and working with our legislature during the last year in establishing metrics by which our universities might reasonably be measured. So I invite President Barron to say a few words. Woo!
Someday I'm going to do that on an iPad too. That just looks nice. Well, welcome. I'm glad that you're here. I'm going to step back first and go to the end of World War II and the launch of Sputnik. And I sort of marvel at the reaction of this nation. It was quite powerful. The president's first science advisor wrote a lengthy tome on science, The Endless Frontier, a roadmap for post-war science and technology. But fundamentally, when he wrote that, what he cited was the central role of technological innovation and entrepreneurship in both the economic security of the nation and the geopolitical security of the nation. And we watched the funding of public universities truly be created by this nation to move it forward, to make sure that we were always in the lead in terms of technological innovation and in terms of entrepreneurship. That also was the time in which the GI Bill occurred, and public universities grew tremendously because the sense was that those individuals needed to come back, and to be productive, they needed to be educated. And in fact, that is the reason why this institution made a transition from the Florida State College for Women to Florida State University, because of the number of GIs that were coming back that needed to be educated. The impact of the growth of the American public university was rather dramatic. You can see both in terms of the number of ideas that got transitioned to the marketplace, the growth of American companies. It's just nothing short of amazing. And a recent analysis by a blue ribbon panel of corporate CEOs, educational leaders, and policymakers directly connects the investment in education in this nation to that series of remarkable advances that helped create a truly great nation and a very productive nation. I think all of you could make a list. I don't need to make the list of all those things that came out of this investment in public higher education. But I can summarize what one of those CEOs said, not a direct quote, but he basically said, our nation's vitality, both economic and geopolitical security, our quality of life, is derived from the productivity of a well-educated, well-trained population. The vitality of this nation is dependent on the productivity of a well-educated people. Okay, at this point, I get a little worried because our investment and our commitment to public higher education in this nation is not very strong right now. And you start to worry that you need a Sputnik in order for people to be able to react. If you don't have a threat, will people move forward? And today, that's a little hard to point to a Sputnik. As a matter of fact, I don't think there's probably any time in our history that you couldn't say that the perceived threats to this nation and the world aren't contested. All of them seem to be contested. And if they're not contested, they've been repeated so many times that they seem to have lost their impact. So we get a little tired of hearing what the arguments are. Or they're far enough in the future that we look at them and say we can wait a little while before we make that investment. Or sometimes we're just not aware that those threats are out there. So I can give you some personal examples from my own field and experiences. For more than 2 decades, scientists warned that the dikes in New Orleans would fail because it was inevitable that a hurricane would hit. So here comes, nothing happens. Here comes Katrina, and not only do we spend billions in recovery from Katrina, but we had to spend the money to build the dikes anyway. So really, if you had built those dikes from the beginning, we would have had an experience much closer to the more recent hurricane that occurred. And this is just one of those threats, one of those things that you can always put off to the next year or the next year. Another example, the US basically invented weather forecasting. And weather forecasting was born out of the public investment in atmospheric science and meteorology programs in this country. And we were clearly the world leader in weather forecasting. Not just the world leader, but we can demonstrate over and over and over again that that investment saves this nation billions of dollars every year because of our ability to warn people about what is about to happen. Now, the interesting thing about it is, if I am very generous today, we might rank 3rd in the world in weather forecasting. Some people think we rank 6th in the world in weather forecasting ability, despite what we know is obvious benefit in being able to do it well. So I remember, as part of a National Academy of Sciences panel report that I chaired, that I presented this to the federal government about this nation losing its edge in weather forecasting. And this was the response I got from one of the major administrators of the national program, and I wrote it down. The person said, "The testosterone of scientists who want to be number 1 is not a sufficient reason for this country to maintain the budget of the Weather Service." Now, that's kind of an interesting statement. First of all, I didn't feel that way, but I was sort of grew up with this notion that we're supposed to be the best and that we're more than capable of being the best. But the viewpoint was that payoff needs to be more direct, and I need to see it, and I want to see it right now. And if you can't show it to me, then I don't know why I want to invest just to be the best, because we see what all the potential is for an increased investment in weather forecasting. I remember another example, because it's not just the government, another example where I went to see a potential donor in West Virginia. And my development officer told me, he's a coal miner. My development officer told me, he said, "Don't worry, we're going to go down dirt roads and we're going to come to a mobile home up on blocks, and I don't want you to think I'm taking you someplace strange. This is a very wealthy individual." And so he gave me a tour of his environmental reclamation, and we finally ended up at the docks where he owned a whole series of barges. And he's sitting there talking, and he said, "I sold these barges last year to a major company." I won't name the major company. and I sold them for $1.2 million to the company. And I thought that was a little bit strange because the barges were sitting right in front of me and they were clearly his. And so I said, well, if you sold them, how do you still own them? He said, well, they got to the end of the year and they looked at their profit margins and decided that they wanted it to be a little bit higher. And so they put the barges up for sale and I bought them for $600,000. And then this is just, you know, a good old boy just having a good time, and he looks me in the eye and he goes, I'm pretty sure next year they're going to come and try to buy them from me again. Okay, so, you know, one more example. When I was a dean at Penn State University, I had under my wing a group of engineering programs, including petroleum and natural gas engineering. And this nation was in a tremendous slump in terms of exploration and production of petroleum and natural gas. And every school in the nation was shutting down this engineering program because it wasn't profitable. Think of that in a university way. Think more that you had the faculty, but you had 4 students. So how could a university maintain a program? And I remember sitting there with the Board of Trustees at Penn State and having them say to me, Dr. Barron, please explain why you can afford to keep a program in petroleum and natural gas engineering with 4 students, because economically that doesn't make sense. And I said, well, there are very few programs. We have an excellent program. Quality has to count for something, and I don't believe it's going to stay this way. You can watch the production of majors of petroleum and natural gas engineering lag about a year behind the price of oil, and it goes up and down like this. The last cycle, it lagged much longer because there were no programs left in the United States to produce students. And all of a sudden, I had a program where my faculty were paid $70,000 a year, and an undergraduate degree got $100,000 plus a bonus to walk out the door. And then they went after my faculty. And I told some of the majors, I said, you take my faculty, I cannot deliver a single student to you. This is a case where if you just have a tight little economic guideline that guides your choices, you will most certainly make mistakes. Okay, I think the idea here is, does our investment in education and in technology and innovation depend on what we need right now? It's a very different guidance point if it depends on what we need right now. Are we capable in this nation of having a longer view? I quite frankly think that the downfall of this nation may be that we're becoming increasingly short-sighted on what it is that we should be doing. That Weather Service story can be told for a lot of areas where we claim number 1, and it was a source of pride, not an objective. And it was an opportunity, not an objective. And we can tell a lot of different stories about where we've lost that standing. And I think public higher education is another good example. So we need a new paradigm. And I don't know anybody who doesn't tell me we need a new paradigm. But the problem is that's where it all ends in terms of what people think. Well, so we consider part 1 of your topic, the financial resources. And Florida's a pretty good example of what's happening all around the nation. We only have a very small handful of states who have positive budgets for public higher education. Tuition at Florida's public universities increased by 22% from 2007 to 2010. It netted $202 million. At the same time, state support was cut by 19%, a loss of $443 million, a net loss of $241 million. And a lot of people look at these big universities and say, I see what your budget is. I see how big you are. You can find that money. But what they don't realize is every single one of those dollars is an academic dollar. That's not the research dollar. That's not the athletic dollar. That's not a donor dollar. That's none of those other dollars. This is an academic dollar. It's more serious than that because the cuts occur every year, 6 years in a row in the state of Florida. This means you cannot plan because every year you play the game of what you're going to cut all over again. Imagine if the presidents knew in 2007 what was going to happen. We would have taken a completely different set of actions, because what we did do was nibble at everybody, spread the pain. We can make it through this year. We can make it through the next year. And you look at your entire financial model in that way. It's interesting to me that as budgets are cut, regulations go up. And I enjoy my interactions with a lot of different legislators, but I think they're guilty. They feel guilt about taking away all that money, and the only way they survive that guilt is by looking at you and saying, you know, I know you got a lot of fat, and we're going to help you through this problem by telling you how to spend the money that we are giving you. And so it makes the noose just a little bit tighter. And so, you know, one example of that is in our budgets, those tuition increases that have occurred, 1/3 of that has had to go into financial aid. So you have to take away that 1/3 as not something you can invest in faculty or retention or anything else. It's going to financial aid because they're worried about accessibility. Okay. All of this reminds me about the story of the frog. You put a frog in boiling water and it jumps right out. You put a frog in lukewarm water and slowly turn up the heat, and then do it again, and then do it again. The frog eventually just expires as the temperature exceeds the metabolic limit of the frog, because the frog doesn't realize that it's on its way to boiling. This is the equivalent of cutting the budget year in and year out and basically sitting there and taking it. How do you innovate if your budget's cut every year? If each year you're looking for the place to cut, how is it that you decide where it is that you can go invest? Because any investment dollar means that I have to cut someplace else even deeper, and yet I'm barely managing and keeping up with the cuts. It took Florida State 6 years to balance our budget from the cuts that were occurring. 6 years we were running deficits. Okay, so we move on to what are our choices, and it's an interesting set. Some choose to increase the number of students they have and have more tuition revenues that come from it. The problem is, what are they sacrificing in quality? We have an institution in this state that has moved to a student-faculty ratio of 37:1, when the typical of highly ranked universities is closer to 20:1, 22:1. So they're making a conscious decision in order to compensate for budget to basically putting a lot more students into the classroom. As our dean said, more out-of-state students. This was the method that University of Colorado chose when their budgets got cut. And they did that by having more than 50% of their students come from outside the state. And of course, when I say that to our legislators, they go, don't you dare take a public institution and have it educate students from other states. And they believe they're subsidizing those out-of-state students when we know those out-of-state students would be, at this point, subsidizing our in-state students. But the number one complaint I get is it's too hard for a student from Florida to get into this university. Close to 40,000 applicants for 7,000 fall spots. You can see what that pressure is like. So please, don't take more out-of-state students. Philanthropy, I got to admit, the publics here had their hand out to the government over and over and over again, and they just assumed that they didn't have to raise money any other way because they could just go ask for the new building, the new program. That day is gone, so we're behind. We have to pump up our philanthropy effort, but that takes quite a bit of time to do it. And it doesn't pay the faculty member's salary. It pays those extra things that people want to do to make a university special. We can raise tuition, and we're up against the accessibility issue, despite how cheap that we are. We can raise tuition selectively by major or by level. More than half the universities in this country have now chosen that path of selective tuition, charging more for a business major, charging more for a nursing major, charging more for an engineering major, and charging less for a humanities major, or charging more for a junior or senior, because in doing that, they're closer to the job market and they don't have to sustain those loans for as long a period of time. We can become more efficient, and of course this is a huge drive to become more efficient. I'll tell you, there's nothing that drives you to efficiency more than losing 25% of your budget. And so I don't view this one as a problem, because each and every year the list of efficiencies that we developed and savings we developed, they're not just something we're doing for fun. They're doing because that's the only way we can survive with a 25% cut in budget. Try that on any household, and believe me, that'll drive you to be more efficient. Online as a less expensive option. This is a path to go. It has a role to play, but not for every major and not for every student. State support. A lot of people think as we recover, then we'll be saved, but this is also a big challenge, and most people don't believe we'll ever recover where we were before. Okay, and I just have to say that with each cut comes, interestingly, more regulation and more guidance on how to spend it. And so accountability comes into play more than ever before. What is our outcome from that investment in state dollars? The second part of your workshop. Now, my personal opinion is we should welcome accountability. We should not be sitting there looking at people and saying, wait, look what a good job we're doing. If we can't prove that we're doing a good job and do it clearly and in a way that shows that we're efficient and effective in what we're doing, then we should pay the piper now. Because if we can't do it, I don't know any reason why a taxpayer should accept the notion that we're doing fine. We can't just do it by saying, please leave us alone. There are a lot of interesting choices emerging. The Texas model was one example. The Texas model was a cost per student model. It is a speed model which incentivizes the rate of production of students per faculty member. Now, I will tell you right now, that would have closed petroleum and natural gas engineering in the state of Texas. Fascinating, if you think about it. Another one that's quite popular right now is in discussion is employment outcomes. Again, quite interesting. How much money do you make? What percentage of your students are graduated? Now, of course, we're not even ready for this metric, because one of the things that we stopped doing with those budget cuts is we stopped keeping track of where our students were going, because we had a choice of either paying the faculty member to teach the class or keeping the staff member that kept track of where the students were going. So we're looking at that metric, and we don't know the answer to those questions. Plus, and if you look at this, and I actually think Virginia has got this in their system where they're looking at that, and one of the things about it is if you're self-employed, you started a business, you're a zero in the data set. Now, fascinating when we're trying to promote small businesses and jobs, and they're not there. A second thing is you go to grad school, you're not there. And yet every state is talking about how they want more STEM majors. And yet here is what promotes STEM majors. No one is a physicist at the end of their undergraduate career, okay? It just doesn't happen. You have to have that graduate degree. So here, this model of what did you do as an undergraduate and how much money you made, if that doesn't count graduate school, you're in trouble. And no one has a database for anybody that leaves the state. What this means is, and you see it in the state of Virginia, is that when they do that accounting, a regional university will come out looking better than the top-tier universities, which are the ones that are correlated with the highest long-term incomes of its students. Okay. There are a lot of issues in those metrics that people are talking about, so we have to be thoughtful. And I think this is a key thing. We have to be thoughtful. Cost per student disadvantages STEM. You can't teach a chemistry lab and have 500 people sitting in that lab. You cannot do it. There are safety issues among other things, plus you're not going to learn chemistry. I just gave the example of employment outcomes, that if you're not careful about it, you will disadvantage majors in which you're trying to promote, and that doesn't make sense. I actually said this to someone. They said, you know, we should pay attention to the jobs that are created that are in Florida, and that a student must get a job in Florida in order to be counted in this as worthy of a taxpayer dollar. And I said, well, I don't think the parents feel that way. My suspicion is the parents want their son or daughter to be the CEO of Merrill Lynch. And they view that as a good use of their taxpayer dollar. And unfortunately, Merrill Lynch is not headquartered in the state of Florida. Well, okay, Eric. But I'm not sure that the taxpayer should subsidize that student. Maybe they should pay a little bit back. And I said, well, what about the fact that Merrill Lynch has close to 10,000 employees in the state of Florida? Well, we probably should count that. So we realize how difficult it is when you tie higher education to single metrics and single areas of performance that you get perverse outcomes. My favorite one in the speed metric was Dow Chemical. Dow Chemical, in the great wisdom of somebody like me, standing up there said, we're going to look at the speed at which we can process chemicals. The faster we can process a chemical, the more likely we will be successful. And it was an absolute disaster for the chemical company. And the reason was because they went blitzing right by the most promising chemicals in their effort to produce chemicals as fast as they could. And they realized it was much wiser to be thoughtful, not just to try to move through processing quickly, but to be able to detour every time they thought they'd come to something promising. And so you come to a clear conclusion. Single metrics often have perverse outcomes. We have to be looking at accountability as a whole range of things that become important in driving an institution. We can't do today's jobs. It takes 4 years to graduate someone. We have to be thinking about the jobs in the future. The tighter we tie it to what our profit is at the end of the year, my little barge story, the more likely we're going to miss the mark. We have to be able to take that longer view for our students and be thinking about accountability measures that create thinkers, not just production for particular jobs. We also have to realize that we're in a recession, and the recession is driving need, and the recession is driving what's going on. And without being able to innovate and move forward, if we allow the recession to completely dictate what it is that we do, as we grow out of it, we will not be prepared to grow out of it. Okay, this is my view on accountability. We don't want single metrics. We want multiple metrics. We want quality goals. We want efficiency goals. We want student success goals. We need all three of those. If you have those as goals and they're clearly stated, we can set up metrics that match those particular goals. And we need to recognize the fact that one of the great things about this nation is there are multiple choices. All our institutions are not the same. All the people are not the same. They need multiple paths that are forward, so we have to recognize different missions. You set the metrics to match, and then please, please reward us for success. When I worked on a preeminence bill in this state for the last year, people said to me, so what do you expect will happen? And I said, well, you want to know the truth? I bet I have to live with all the performance measures that I just set up, but I'll get none of the money. Because the idea was, we do this, we get this. And I said, we're going to be driven by this and not get any of this. And that's actually very close to what happened. Okay. Here's my other piece of advice. Don't whine. We're in a group of institutions that keeps telling everybody else, leave us alone. We know what we're doing. We're smart people. We've been doing this for a long time. We know what we're doing. When faced with all of these changes, we have to be the ones that say, okay, I'm worried about this outcome, but this is a better way to do it. So my thought, we're likely to have to take every resource option, not just one or two. We need a thoughtful accountability process. Quality, efficiency, student success, multiple metrics, and multiple missions. And we can't manage this year by year, where each year we don't know what the outcome is going to be, especially if each year is something that stops us from doing the innovation that we worked hard to plan the previous year. Okay, so I just want to close with this last statement. The vitality of this nation and the world is derived from the productivity of a well-trained, well-educated people. The productivity of a well-trained, well-educated people. We know this works from every single bit of history. And so we just have to figure out how it is we're going to do that by balancing all those financial options with an accountability system that is based on goals that help us be successful. I hope you have a wonderful workshop, and I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thanks, President Barron. And now I'd like to introduce Professor Carolyn Harrington, who will introduce our next keynote speaker.
Thank you, Marcy. Thank you, President Barron. And it's very nice to have an addition of the students joining us. It is their institution we're talking about here. I don't think anyone could have laid out in starker terms some of the challenges facing higher education than Dr. Barron has just laid out, specific to this state and to this public institution. The title of the symposium, Shared Dreams, Separate Interests, I think speaks to what is certainly a feeling that there has been a growing gap between the institutions themselves, the people who are in the institutions, the policymakers for whom these are, for the public institutions for whom these are the objects of their support, and of course that applies to private as well, and to society at large. The United States, I think, has been unique in its continuing and long-held aspirations for higher education. We have been very, very generous in what we want from higher education and in our confidence that advanced education, advanced research brings a more compassionate society, brings a more energetic society, brings a more productive workforce, and brings a better educated citizenry. It is alarming to see this growing gap. On the other hand, I think there has always been a distance between higher education institutions themselves and the governments that have funded them. I had the pleasure last week of being at the College of William and Mary, the second oldest college of higher education in the country. They were initially funded by the government of England, by charter granted by William and Mary, the monarchy. The institution began to have trouble with its funding source as well. By the time of the American Revolution, the funding was cut off. It revived itself under a new country, a new name, and a new set of institutions. So I think there is much reason to think that we too are able to take a hold of the pressures that we're facing today, and because of this deep belief in the American citizenry, of the power and the promise of higher education, that it will continue to play the critical and energetic role it's played in our country's past. I don't think anyone has thought more about higher education, financing, accountability, and the relationship between society and higher education institutions and public funding than our keynote speaker this morning. I'm very proud to introduce Dr. Dave Brenneman from the University of Virginia, who will speak to us about higher education finance and accountability. And you will take questions afterwards.
I'd like to get this computer off the table here because I have to, can I move it? Without killing it? Is there a
Yeah, where's our?
technology person here? I just want to get this off the,
There, he's coming.
sorry for the delay. I just need to have the platform. Okay. I'm a little cautious with computers these days because last week I did something I hope you never do. I spilled a glass of wine on my Mac Air. And let me tell you, if wine does to your body what it does to the insides of a computer, you don't ever want to drink it again. I'm delighted to be here. You've heard actually some extraordinarily good remarks thus far, and to some extent we're all singing out of the same choir book, so I have nothing but respect for what I've heard. Because what people are really saying to you, I think, is that higher education in this country is on the cusp of some sort of necessary transformation in order to continue doing what its job is in this country. I mean, we are operating on a form of finance and management and governance that is eroding and changing and shifting and in various ways, which have caused a number of people that are looking at this thing seriously to think that somehow the future won't be just an extension of precisely what we've done in the past. The way some people talk about this is that the, quote, business model of higher education is broken, that what we've come to rely on is no longer as reliable as it once was, that we have a new set of national goals that we need to reach in this country for both moral reasons and for economic reasons, and that the system as currently configured may not get us there, that we may simply fail at achieving what I think most of us would like to see happen. Now, I'm old enough to have lived through these cycles of boom-bust that your president spoke about, and he's absolutely right. I mean, the standard pattern, I think, in most public institutions of higher education is to sort of say, well, there's a business cycle, and every decade we'll have a recession, and we'll get whacked, excuse me, our budget will get whacked for a couple of years. But we spread the pain, and we cut travel budgets, and we maybe suspend hiring for a year or two, and maybe raises for a year or two. But then the economy will recover, and we'll get the money back, and so there's no need to do anything fundamental. We just ride it out and build in shock absorbers, and we've been pretty good at that. I think now we're perhaps, first off, this recession is unlike virtually any other since the Great Depression. In fact, it's now officially, I guess, labeled the Great Recession. And it's a slower and harder recovery for reasons I won't bore you with. So that's one issue. But I think a number of people are pretty sure there's a change in the underlying philosophy of how this enterprise of ours should be financed and managed. Britt Kirwan, who is about my age and is a very distinguished chancellor of the University of Maryland system, in a conversation I had with him a couple of years ago, we were doing a series of interviews with college and university presidents about some of these issues. And he said, you know, if at in my career, he said, if at the beginning of any decade you had forecast that higher education would somehow look different at the end of the decade, you'd have been wrong. I mean, it's very stable, you know, and it moves forward and things don't change very much. And he said, I firmly believe, and this was 2 years ago, so we were at the beginning of the current decade. He says, I currently believe if you made that forecast this year for 2020 or 2022, it will look different. It's got to look different. It just can't, we've run out the string on this particular set of of policies. And he says, I don't have any idea where it's heading and how we're going to get there, but I do believe that this is a time of transition. I mean, we are facing, as the President said, serious fiscal and performance issues that almost look like trying to solve them is like trying to square the circle. Let me give you a quick outline of my talk. We have 3 colleagues and I, in the last few months, published a book called Financing American Higher Education in the Era of Globalization, and it reflects the work that we had undertaken over several years to try to, in a sense, see if there were answers we could find for the very tough dilemmas that your president posed. And I'm going to work off that book as the core of my remarks to you. I'll say a bit more about how it came to pass and so forth. I'm also going to, when I finish that, I'm going to talk about some of the other proposals that are kicking around. Washington, I have discovered, I was at the Brookings Institution back in the 70s, and we were one of the only games in town. I mean, we were the premier think tank, and there was this fledgling upstart called the American Enterprise Institute. And there was something called the Heritage Foundation that Joe Coors was financing, and we thought that was pretty tacky. But now there are hundreds of think tanks in Washington, D.C. You can't even keep track of them, and many of them have some very bright people writing about higher education. You have Education Sector, New America Foundation, Cato Institute, on and on and on. So there are lots of people throwing ideas out there, and I'll touch on just a handful of the ones that I think are interesting. I'll turn briefly then, and I'm not an expert on governance, but I'll say a few words about governance in our universities. And if you're a really good audience and you don't throw me off the stage too early, I'll even tell you a little bit about the UVA troubles of the last summer, which has probably been one of the most phenomenal governance issues that this country has ever lived through, with a very, so far, surprising result. So that's the plan. Let me begin by saying a word or two about the book. The authors, my co-authors, are Bill Zametta, who is a professor in the Evans School of Public Policy at the University of Washington, Seattle, and also a professor in the School of Education at the University of Washington. He writes extensively on finance. Pat Callan, who some of you may know, Pat is a longtime state coordinating board, oversight board official, working first in Montana, then Washington, and for a long time in the state of California. And for about the last 20-some years, he's been financed by a variety of private foundations to run both, essentially his own shop, the most recent one, the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education. And it was really out of the work of that center, which I'll say a word or two about, that prompted the 4 of us to get together to write this book. The 4th author, Joni Finney, worked with Pat for many years and is now a professor of practice in the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania, actually doing a professional EDD program, much as I guess one of our colleagues here from Georgia does in Atlanta. The principal project of this national center, from which all 4 of us were loosely affiliated, was a project called Measuring Up, which was a decade-long effort to benchmark state performance in higher education, benchmarking states against each other. It didn't have policy proposals. It was enormously data intensive. We looked at the way and it wasn't institutionally based, it was state-based. The state was the subject we were looking at. How does the state prepare its young people for higher education? What is the participation rate? How affordable is it? What are the outcomes, the completion rates? What are the societal benefits that accrue from an educated populace? And what are the state of, we were one of the first ones, I think, to say how much are people actually learning? And we published this, and it's now finished. We did 5 of these reports, and we gave the states grades of A through F in all of those categories. By the end of the period, we were flunking every state except California on affordability, And that, interestingly enough, made us very unpopular with most public university presidents because it was making it harder to raise tuition, which is what all of them felt they needed to do at that time. But we didn't, based on what we were seeing about the performance of the system of higher education, we began to worry about, we began to think we had a responsibility to say something about what to do about some of these issues we were concerned about. Our model was a book that a few of you may vaguely remember. Any of you remember the Carnegie Commission on Higher Education? How quickly we forget. Clark Kerr, the former president of the University of California, ran this remarkable commission from about 1967 well up into through the 70s. And they wrote a 5-foot bookshelf on higher education. I mean, they covered every topic under the sun. And one of their best reports in 1973 was called Higher Education, Who Pays, Who Benefits, Who Should Pay. And it is one of those seminal works that sort of locked in a series of sort of rules of thumb about finance that I think most people will still to this day quote and not have any idea where it came from. So things like students should pay 1/3 of the cost. That sort of rule of thumb, which you typically hear, that came right out of the Carnegie Commission. So we set out to sort of say, can we update and redo that volume for a new era? The work extended over several years, but we began our thinking about this topic and our concern about it long before the, quote, Great Recession. So this isn't just a quick and dirty response to the tough times of the last 3 years. We were worried about things back even when times were, quote, good. So the Great Recession just added further fuel to the fire. I will say one thing to those of you who are faculty members: be very cautious about attempting to write a book with 4 authors in 4 different locations in the United States of America. Very hard to do. Much better to just sit down and write your own book. But actually, we all contributed in important ways to this, and it does reflect all of our joint thinking. And frankly, another goal of mine, because I teach higher ed finance every year as a graduate course at the University of Virginia, I wanted something that was like a textbook almost that you could use with students that would cover the whole complexity of this topic. So much of the literature on higher education finance, and it's a good and rich literature, are one-shot deals that look at Pell Grants, or they look at student loans, or they look at state student aid programs, or they look at appropriations for state universities, or they look at community colleges, or they look at the financing of private colleges, or they look at the for-profit sector. But those are all just little, that's sort of like, you know, the old story about everybody touching a part of the elephant and trying to describe it. We tried to describe the elephant in one volume, which might have been the reason it took so long. Now, there are two, this is an oversimplification, but I think there are 2 really big policy issues facing higher education in this country right now. And in your remarks from the President Barron, you heard the first one discussed brilliantly, I think, which is the future of the public research university. I think that is a topic that lots of people, smart people, intelligent people are worried about. And he covered that very well, I think. A second issue, however, and you're well aware of this too, I think, is there's a perception that we need to deepen the nation's human capital by graduating more citizens with degrees, bachelor's degrees, associate's degrees, certificates, some sort of post-secondary experience beyond high school, that the kind of economy we have evolved into is one in which people without some form of skill development and education beyond high school, people are almost doomed to very low standards of living and poor labor market experiences. And this has been codified by the Obama administration with their goal to get back on the top of the international league tables by 2020 in terms of degree production. The Lumina Foundation, which has emerged as a major funder of higher education studies, has their own version, which is to get something like 60% of our population with some form of post-secondary credential by 2025. So there are different models of what this is, but the basic message is we got to produce more people with degrees and certificates and associate degrees than we're producing today. And yet we're being asked to do this, as the President Barron said, at a time when the state funding is being cut back. Now, both of these policy goals, the future of the public research university and the need to expand our output of degreed citizens, have their links to the economy and its performance, but there are also, I think, and you can't be from the University of Virginia without quoting or referencing Thomas Jefferson at least once. It's part of the Jeffersonian vision of a broadly educated citizenry, which I must admit in my more bleak moments watching this campaign makes me wonder what has happened to our broadly educated citizenry. But that's not for public attribution. So our book does not focus on the future of the public research university. So those of you who only care about FSU are free to get up and take off right now. We're looking at the second goal. How do we produce more people, significantly more people with degrees? Another term for this is the completion agenda. That's become one of the other catchphrases because people have observed the fact that the access agenda got a lot of young people into college, but we didn't do a terribly good job of getting them through their programs. We had a little more than a 50% completion rate. So that's the focus of our book. And I have concluded one thing: it's desirable to keep these two separate in your mind and not conflate them, as I think many policymakers are. When they conflate them, what they do is try to push the research universities to increase their undergraduate enrollments, which is precisely the wrong thing to do in general, it seems to me. This is the most expensive way to do that. You're deflecting resources away from the central mission of the university, which should be research and graduate education, as well as undergraduate education. And most of these more selective elite institutions don't really want to grow very much. I mean, Princeton isn't just dying to run out there and add 1,000 students to its undergraduate population, and they won't, and probably they shouldn't, and we shouldn't be pushing this growth agenda onto a set of institutions for which it is not the right tack to take, and I'll elaborate on that in a bit. Okay, the logic of the book, our first chapter sort of sets the stage. It actually runs through some of the same kinds of data that you've heard in the early part of today's conversation. One thing it does do that wasn't mentioned, it talks a lot about the changing demography of this country, and I suspect in most cases you know the story, but the population that is increasing and that will be part of the intake for these programs is increasingly minority, it's increasingly low income, and it's increasingly students or potential students from families that do not have a tradition of higher education. They don't know how to work the system. And so, and they have not been in all cases by any means well served by the current system. So it's, in a sense, we're going to have to make the expansion for our own benefit. It's not just a nice and lovely thing to do, but we're going to have to make the expansion with a group that is going to be harder to succeed with than if we had been working with the population that we had in the country, say, after World War II and during the baby boom. So we talk a great deal about who's coming to college or who should be coming. So we cover the demography and then pose the obvious challenge, set up the book by saying how do we make these increases with groups that have not fared well in the past, with state support dropping and tuition rising. I mean, it almost seems like an impossible set of goals to accomplish. And our conclusion is we can't even hope to meet these goals with the current financial model. I mean, we've got to think anew on how we can do this. Chapter 2 in the book takes a look at this really somewhat controversial question of, do we really need all these increased degrees and credentials? There is a fairly widespread view out there that, and it's been exacerbated by the recession, where a number of college graduates are struggling to get jobs, and you're reading about how half the graduates of the class of 2011 are back home living in the basement again or something. And so people are saying, why are we actually trying to pump more people out into this system when the ones that are coming out now can't even get jobs? Well, we work our way through that, and we look at the various arguments. Obama's goals seem to be driven in large part by this set of OECD international comparisons, which, you know, if you're my age, you're used to saying the United States is the premier higher educational system in the world, and we graduate more, and we adopted mass higher education before anybody else. And then lo and behold, the OECD puts out numbers that suggest we're dropping like a rock. I mean, there are a number of European and Asian countries that are outstripping us now on degree completions, participation rates, and so forth. So we're no longer the number one on that particular set of measures. And the Obama administration, I think, in part is driven by the sense we should get back there. Now, that just trying to be number one may not be the world's smartest thing to do, but I think underlying that is the notion that this ties in closely to the economy and our competitiveness, the globalization. Lumina's goal, I don't know where they got their goal. I mean, they just, you know, if you're a private foundation, who's gonna not take your money because they don't like your goal? I mean, it's hard to punish a foundation in one-way transfer of assets. But anyway, they've got a goal, and they're I shouldn't say this, but they're almost pompous enough to think that the whole world should stand up and salute their goal. I mean, they really think they've got the message. And I think that's a little overbearing. But they nonetheless, I mean, they're sort of working in the same channels, slightly different metrics and different dates and so on. And then there are various labor economists. One of the more vocal ones is Tony Carnevale out of Georgetown. And his argument is that my generation, which is nearing retirement, was the best educated generation in history, and that as we retire from the labor force, the younger people coming forward aren't as well educated on average as we were. So we're facing a real problem of replacement in the labor force with people with skills and training as the equivalent of the generation nearing retirement. So he has a sort of a different take on it. All of these arguments, though, make the point that we should be doing more. And there are those who argue against that, and we review those arguments. And our conclusion is that none of these goals are, you know, worth hanging your hat on and you know, betting the ranch on. I mean, this country has a strange fascination with setting these almost impossible goals. Remember the 1989 goals? We were going to be first in the world in mathematics, education. We do this in education all the time. We set these ridiculous goals, and then people just can't make them. No Child Left Behind was filled with these kinds of things. But this is not an unreasonable goal. It's not an unreasonable goal to think we should do a better job. I mean, that's about where we come out. The third and fourth chapters in the book sort of review the history of how we got to our current situation. What's the story that got us to this point? And it looks pretty closely at the federal role, which evolved over the last part of the last half of the last century. Talks a lot about the state situation. The big bogeyman in state budgets, by and large, is Medicaid. I mean, Medicaid is the fastest growing piece of state budgets, and it's just squeezing out support for higher education in a context in which we won't tax ourselves anymore. You know, we've been living in this no new taxes environment for 30 years, and so you don't raise revenues, and you've got a largely uncontrollable incentive match program from the federal government that's pushing up Medicaid, and higher education is the big discretionary item in the budget. So that's what you can cut. And we're one of the few parts of state budgets where we have other revenue sources. It's pretty hard to charge tuition or a fee to go to jail. We still don't charge too many of our elementary and secondary school students tuition. Most of the state activities do not have these revenue sources, and we do. So we are the ones that are taking the hit. We talk about the you know, the growth of the human, I was in graduate school in economics in the late 60s out at Berkeley, and that's when this whole fascination with higher education really came to fruition. Gary Becker, an economist at the University of Chicago, produced a book called Human Capital, and he had the audacity to sit there and compute the internal rate of return on investment in higher education, which he argued was about 12%. A good investment. And he compared it to investing in machines, physical capital, and came up with the notion that, well, investing in humans is human capital. And boy, that idea took the field by storm. A colleague of mine at Brookings, Ed Dennison, coming from an entirely different direction, looking at the sources of economic growth, you know, if you take the, say, 3% growth that the economy experiences, how do you break that down and attribute it? And he attributed everything he could to physical inputs, and labor, land, capital, and so forth. And he came up with about half of it that he couldn't explain. And he said that must be increased education and knowledge generation. And so from a completely different direction, he came out with the same answer that Becker did. We should be spending more on education. And so that has been in the context, in the background, I think, for now nearly 50 years. And I think it's accurate and still relevant. It has had the unfortunate effect, however, of undermining the notion of higher education as a public good. It has inadvertently, and I think not intentionally, but just because you could measure that, it has tended to cause us to think of higher education as a private benefit. And it's not surprising that legislators pressed to find ways to alter the funding of higher education would argue that why don't we have students pay more if they're the principal beneficiary and they're going to earn it all back through higher earnings. So let's push more and more of the costs on them and take it off the back of the general taxpayer. And there are reasonable arguments to do that to some degree. But I think economics has fed this tendency to try to embed market-like principles into our system, which really didn't. When I first started my first teaching job, if you made the stupid mistake, it never would have occurred to you, but if you had talked about a student as a consumer or a customer, you'd have been laughed out of, you know, or that we're an industry, or any of these terms. Just in 1970, those were not in vogue, and now they're everywhere. So the market concepts and the market metaphors have penetrated deeply into our system. More recently, we've seen the sharp increase in student debt. We'll talk about that a bit. The growing worry about rising college costs to parents. I mean, that's a huge political issue. And a generalized loss of trust in professionals in all capacities. I mean, education, judges, doctors, there were a series of learned professions that used to kind of get a pass from society on the accountability front because they were viewed as using their education and their greater wisdom for the benefit of all. I mean, that was kind of the context. Now we second guess doctors, you know, we go to websites and we go to WebMD and we, you know, you get third opinions. We're not sure judges. We look at the way we're questioning the Supreme Court. Are these distinguished, disinterested professionals, or are they just party hacks? And I think educators have fallen under the same questioning. Are we really teaching people how to read and write? Are we really doing a good job? Are college students learning anything? We've had this recent book, Academically Adrift, carrying the message that 35% of the undergraduates at some very distinguished schools don't learn anything in 2 years of college. So there's been an erosion, I think, of people they're not willing to take our word for it that we're doing the best job we can. And that's very hard to reverse once that happens. The fifth chapter takes a very close look at the variety of different state policies that we have in place in this country. One of the devilishly hard aspects of this topic in this nation, this federal system of ours, is you've got 50 states that have very different higher ed systems and very different cultures and histories. Some are high tuition, high aid, some are low tuition, some rely a lot on community colleges, some rely on private nonprofit institutions. So fashioning a policy, a set of policies that mesh with all these different approaches is devilishly difficult. We also have very differing governance structures. We have coordinating board states like Virginia, where each university has its own governing board. And you have system states like North Carolina, where you have a single system and one big governing board, and the campuses don't have their own governing boards. That alters the story. And then we have very different economic and demographic situations in the various states. Some of our states are expecting very high growth with increasingly large percentages of minority. It's sort of the band on the lower part of the United States, where there's terrific growth. Some parts of New England are actually looking at and parts of upper Midwest are looking at population loss. So the states are not in the same place to try to look at and talk about. Chapter 6 takes a look at if we're going to try to expand the output of our systems dramatically, do we have the educational capacity to do it? Do we have the supply of places? Could we physically do this? Normally, if you look at the literature on higher education, we act like supply is infinitely expansive. I mean, if the demand is there, magically out of nowhere, somebody will supply the spaces. But if you're talking about this kind of non-incremental growth, it's not clear at all that we can do that. The Obama goals literally call for an additional 8.2 million degrees and certificates by 2020 over what we would otherwise produce. Stop and think about that. That's an annual growth rate of 4.2% a year. And in enrollment terms, it would mean roughly a 33% increase in college enrollments. Non-trivial. Is there a supply that can meet that? So we looked at the history of the various sectors in higher education, the research universities, the ASCU, the comprehensive regional publics, the two-year colleges, the private colleges, the for-profit colleges. Which ones of them have shown a history of being able to expand capacity over a number of years? And our bottom line conclusion is this job is going to be solved for good or evil in the two-year colleges, the comprehensive regional publics, and the for-profit institutions. The for-profit sector, full of controversy. I mean, I get calls literally from lawyers down here in Florida about once a month asking me if I'll be an expert witness on some claim against a for-profit institution in Florida. So they're all caught up in many of them are caught up in issues of fraud and abuse, but nonetheless, they are now almost 10% of our undergraduate enrollments in this country. That's up sharply from less than 1% 10 years ago. So this is one sort of expansion bolt that we have, and I guess one of our assumptions is we're going to have to make sure we get these outfits working properly, because I think we're going to have to rely on them. They're going to have to be a major part of the expansion supply for our system. Now, in focusing on the institutions I'm focusing on, what I'm saying is we shouldn't be thinking this is a problem that's going to be solved in the selective privates and the flagship campuses. And if you look at the way people write and talk about higher education, you'd almost never know we have anything in this country but about 50 institutions that everybody obsesses over. You know, the endless stories about, you know, does it matter if you go to Yale versus Brown? You know, that sort of, who cares? I mean, that's of absolutely no policy interest. It matters to Yale and Brown, but to nobody else. But we talk about and we write about that and we care about that and we worry about our flagship campuses, but we don't spend much time talking and thinking about our comprehensive regional state universities, our two-year colleges. Although I'm happy to say I think the two-year colleges are sort of coming into their own in the last year or two. The Obama administration has really, I think, focused on them as major players. So we're saying some of the policy emphasis of the next decade has got to focus on a set of institutions that don't have some of the options that many of the rest of us have. They don't have options to go out and raise huge amounts of private money. They can't raise tuition through the roof. They're going to win or not lose, win or die. on the strength of what the states and the federal government do. Okay, let me then turn to our final chapter, which puts out our proposals, and let me run through these quickly. Some of the ideas. There is no silver bullet. I mean, if I had a silver bullet that solved these problems, I wouldn't be here. I'd be pointing lots of dollars on the consulting trail or something. So there's no silver bullet, and that's frustrating to people. People would like to have some magic wand you could do. On the federal scene, and we think the federal government has done quite a bit in the last few years. The Obama administration has finally kicked the banks out of the student loan business and turned it into a direct loan program, which many of us thought should have happened years ago. Sharp savings in that move, I think. There's been a sharp increase in the average Pell Grant. The maximum Pell Grant now is up to about $5,500. That had been stymied at sort of a stagnant level for a number of years. And they've put a lot of pressure on the for-profits. I mean, they've been really grinding on these institutions to make sure that they, because they're almost fully federally funded. I mean, the for-profit institutions would dry up and go away tomorrow if the feds didn't have Pell Grants and loans. So it's a legitimate federal and state concern. So we don't look for magic out of Washington. We've got more than enough fiscal problems there. We do think, the one idea we do have is, some of you are old enough to remember the old SSIG program, which was a federal matching program to try to, it stood for State Student Incentive Grants. Then it got, these names, it got renamed LEAP. And Leveraging Educational Access Program or something. Anyway, point is, it was an incentive program to the states to increase state student aid, need-based student aid, with a federal match. And when it was a small program, it never grew to the size people had hoped it might. Some people had hoped it might. But it did cause a lot of states to start their own state student aid programs. And we suggest something along that line. It's nearly dead now. They've tried to kill it for years. It may be zeroed out in the current budget. We think something like that might make sense again. And the other idea that I think is potential dynamite, and that is, once we got the commercial banks out of the system as the source of loan capital, and the federal government is advancing the loan capital, we now have the potential to realize something that was a dream 30, 40, 50 years ago, but we all gave up on, which is a system of totally income contingent student loans. The funds produced initially by the federal government, and the collection managed through the IRS income tax system. In other words, Australia is doing something and Britain is doing something very similar to this. Most of us had given up on the idea because the banks never wanted to do it and the IRS didn't want to do it. But now we've got, if this is federal money being advanced, it seems to me a case can be made for asking the IRS. And that would have the capacity to take what is now a loan that you get and have to repay regardless of the labor market experiences you have. It would cause the people who don't fare well in the labor market to have their loans slowly but surely turned into a grant after the fact, rather than putting all the grant money on your current income, your family's current income, which you could argue is kind of the wrong model. So I think there's a huge potential here to do something good with the loan program. And the loan programs absolutely have to be reformed. I mean, there's just no question we're reaching problem points with the loan programs on a lot of different levels. And they're becoming so dominant as the way we finance higher ed. Okay, those are the fundamental ideas we had for the federal government. We also endorsed the notion that we should stop earmarking money to individual campuses, usually for mission creep. You know, the state college that wants to become a university gets its congressman to bring them a $30 million grant to start some big research center. And mission creep is one of the things we're absolutely dead certain has to be prevented, in that we can't keep turning state colleges into universities. It's just, we don't need them, and it's just not a good use of they've got a bigger job to do, which is doing more education. On the states side, we argue that the states should decide whether they're going to enter into this game about trying to increase the number of graduates. A number of states have. The state of Virginia, Governor McDonnell has bought on, and he's got us all set up to increase our output by 100,000 degrees in the next decade. 8 or 10 or 12 states have done this. I don't think Florida has yet. If Florida chose to do it, it would entail, an outfit called NCHEMS, which is a nonprofit consulting firm in Boulder, Colorado, took the national goals and tracked them down into the goal. What would that mean for each state based on its history and its size and its growth rate and so forth? And in Florida, it would mean approximately 9,000 more degrees and associate degrees and certificates per year for every year from 2010 forward, or an average annual increase just under 5%. So you're slightly above the rate that would be required for the nation if you adopted that. A lot of the criticism of student aid, we rely on student aid, a lot of the criticisms have focused on their information, the information problem. Students have a hard time navigating the system. It's complicated. You have to apply, you have to take SATs, you wait for 5 months, and then you get stuff from the campus that tells you what your net price will actually be. And the FAFSA is getting simpler to fill out, the federal financial aid document, but it has been at times compared to the income tax forms in its complexity. So it's not surprising that many, many students just get swamped and get lost in the system. And a lot of people have been arguing for more early commitment programs that would, the classic one, I hate the program, the HOPE program from Georgia. I think it's got all the wrong stuff in it in many ways, but it's brilliant because it's simple, it's clean, everybody can understand it. You get a B average in high school, and you get a ride to the public universities in Georgia as long as you maintain a B average. End of story. I mean, everybody can understand that. I only wish some of our need-based programs could be presented in such a simple, understandable way, and unfortunately they have gotten so complicated they're not easy to do that way. But anyway, we can focus, I think the states and colleges in their wisdom can try to work on better helping people understand how this system works than they do now. We want to be sure to utilize any spare space we have in our private nonprofit colleges. That may not be that large a number, but there are a lot of small colleges that are not terribly selective that are really struggling to fill their spots, and it would be foolish for us not to come up with systems that would help them get students into those slots. It's cheaper than building more capacity. We've got to focus on part-time older students. Many of the states numerically can't meet these goals with just their 18-year-old populations. They've got to do a better job with the adults who have maybe gotten some college but not finished and would like to return. A lot of people in that situation, and I think we should be focusing on those. Somehow tuition increases, which we think unfortunately are probably inevitable, have to be gradual, moderate, and predictable. I mean, part of the President's remarks this morning talked about the impossibility of planning in an environment where the governor can step in and freeze your tuition 1 year, let you expand it the next, cut it back the next. We went through that in Virginia in the 90s. We had when George Allen became governor, he froze our in-state tuition for 4 years. Then Jim Gilmore followed him in 1999, and it was the height of the dot-com boom, and he thought revenues were going to grow forever. He cut our in-state tuition 20%. So if you entered in 1997, you graduated paying a lower tuition than when you started, which is kind of odd. He couldn't keep his promise. I mean, the revenues, the dot-com boom imploded, the revenues went away, and immediately the next governor came in and there was a wink and a nod, and up went our tuition by 8 and 10% a year. So you get this crazy yo-yo effect with tuition and appropriations, and as your president made very clear, it is almost impossible to plan sensibly in that kind of environment, and that's one of the structural issues that's going to have to be worked out if we're going to have any chance of getting where we need to go. We think that funding we should be re-emphasizing student-linked funding. I mean, you know, when I grew up in this business, almost all states did enrollment-driven funding. You know, you got so many students, you got another so many dollars or whatever. And then those all seem to go away for most places somewhere in the early 90s and sort of into an ad hoc system where there isn't much of a formula. And we think that those have to be done, and we think there should be more experimentation with linking those two outcomes. Now that's controversial because, as your president indicated, there's one concern is if you start tying money to outcomes, you know, these are incentives, powerful incentives. And if you do that, you may get lowered quality. The other fear people have is it will cause some institutions to start cherry picking the students they admit. I mean, why would you take a highly risky student who might drop out if that dropout would cost you? So if you are in a position to do it, you do cream skimming. You don't take in risky students. So these incentives have to be thought out very clearly. But we think there is a case for doing some of that. We could certainly provide incentives for increased productivity. And I'll talk a bit about technology, which is now everybody's favorite answer to all our problems. Year-round operation, 3-year degrees, making those at least possible for those who want them. Improved pedagogical approaches to remediation. I think the whole way we do remedial education in this country is terrible in terms of helping students get through. And we need to develop a stronger state policy capacity than we seem to have in many of our states. I don't know how you do that. Other proposals. Let me shift ground now to a few of the policy reports that you may have seen or may want to look at. In April, the Brookings Institution brought out a very nice report on state student aid programs, sort of a small part of the system, but one that has some real potential. And one of their key recommendations was that we start trying to connect aid both not only to need, but to completion. And that report has stumbled into the same controversy I mentioned before, but people are trying to say access alone is not enough. Access and completion, in some sense, should be our goal. The Committee for Economic Development put out a report in that same month, which broadly echoes the outlines of our book, in part because all of us were advisors to the Committee of Economic Development group. But in this case, the target was the business community. We were trying to put out a brief, readable document that business communities, business leaders could take, in part to indicate to them in their own self-interest that they should be helping our institutions meet these goals, these ambitious goals. Tennessee, as was mentioned, and you may have a chance to hear more from Eric Nessa on this on the panel. Tennessee has just announced a funding system that is entirely based on outcomes, and it's an interesting idea. My understanding is that South Carolina tried something similar about a decade ago and absolutely flopped. I mean, it was a complete failure for reasons that one might imagine. But I think Tennessee seems to have moved toward this in a more thoughtful fashion, and we'll look to Eric to tell us a little bit about that. It's an interesting model. Our local state legislator called me immediately when he read about it and said, "What is this all about, and can we think about doing this?" So it's attracting attention. The Western Governors University, which started out in the West as essentially a place you could bring credits and have them validated, and you could have life experience validated, and you could combine, if you were a swirler, a student who's taking 6 courses here and 5 courses there, and you can't find an institution to package them for you into a degree, Western Governors would do that. They've now started their own instructional programs, and they are spreading to other states. Indiana brought them in. I forget, 2 or 3 other states have reached out. I think that's a nonprofit, for-profit, essentially. It works, it operates, and seems to me much as the for-profit institutions, but in a nonprofit context. Technology and online learning, big topic. Clayton Christensen at Harvard Business School has turned this thing into every Wall Streeter's fantasy. His idea of disruptive innovation, which is a brilliant, if you've ever heard his discussion about the computer industry and how that evolved over time, and then the steel mills. He's got a model for how technology or other forms of innovation enter into a mature industry and undercut it from below and eventually kill the big one on top. And he's now applying that to higher education. He's got an essay out called Disrupting College, and board members are reading this stuff because it's all written up in the Wall Street Journal, and so you've got a bunch of board members now who think Christensen has got the answer to the world's problems, and they're bringing those into the boardroom, so it's an issue to deal with. Other related factors are the National Center for Academic Transformation, an operation run by a woman named Carol Twigg, who does course redesign involving technology. And you'll redo an introductory statistics course, substituting technology for full professors to some degree, and lowering costs, but keeping measured learning constant or even improving. There's an out of Carnegie Mellon, there's the Open Learning Initiative, which is spreading now. I think the community colleges have a big grant from Lumina that they're trying to use that. That's sort of using technology, but using it with a cognitive science backdrop so that you get, the professor will ask, they'll take courses online or take an exam on, read something, take a little quiz, try to answer the quiz, and the way they think about the answer gets fed back to the professor, immediately in real time, and that allows the professor to, it's for blended courses. You then go into the classroom and you know where people are having trouble rather than just assuming, not knowing and just boring some and losing others. So there are some fascinating things out there, and I think Coursera, these MOOCs, whatever, that's a horrible acronym, isn't it? MOOC, massive online open courses or open online courses. I mean, all this stuff there's this huge periphery around higher education right now of technology infused activities. And I think the right stance to take on it at this point is open-minded, supportive, skeptical. I think the jury's out. It's not clear if some of these things have any kind of underlying business model. I don't know what the MOOC model is how that's ever gonna become sustaining. But they may figure out a way if they start giving, it all hinges on whether they can get credits into the system for a thing like that. But these are exciting ideas, and what worries me is I think people are too quick to jump to the notion that they are the silver bullet. And I just think it's too complicated. There have been too many failures of these kinds of programs. I think another decade from now we will have learned a great deal, and I suspect that will be a stronger part of the total structure. But I think it's too early to assume that they are going to. I go to a forum in Aspen every summer on the future of higher education, and we had one of the zealots of this kind of thing talking to us several years ago, telling us we were all toast. We're gone. End of story. Next year he came back and he said, "You're still toast, but it's taking longer than I thought. You're like these smug people lying on the beach, suntanning and happy, and there's a tsunami out there waiting to come in. In 5 years, you're toast." And the third year he came back and he had to say that the thing he was so excited about had just gone bankrupt. So there's a danger in jumping on any one of these things too quickly, I think. The flagship publics, I don't know, to some extent I guess you were doing some of this here, are really working on the agenda of greater autonomy, tuition control, quasi-privatization of parts of the offerings. At UVA, our law school and our business school are both effectively privatized. They get no state support, they charge market rate tuition, and they, quote, release state funds to the rest of us who can't do that. There's been talk, Virginia Military Institute, VMI, a public sort of liberal arts college that used to be only for men. It was prepared cadets. They were under court order to admit women, and the good old boys did not want women at VMI. So they said, we're going to figure out how to run this place privately. And so they got contributions, and alumni poured money in, and they did this and that. And they came up with the notion that they could now meet the operating budget without any state appropriation. So they went to the governor and said, we're going to become private. And the governor said, okay, but first you have to pay us for the campus. Those are our buildings, and all that equipment, everything physical on that, including the grounds, belonged to the state of Virginia. And here's the bill. You know, it was like several $100 million. End of story. No more privatization, and we now have women at VMI. RCM, responsibility-centered budgeting. Some people think that may be a help, that it will provide. I don't know if you're on anything like that here at FSU. We're actually transitioning to it at Virginia. Terry Sullivan they're on it at Michigan, and she's bringing it to UVA. And the idea is it provides incentives for deans to be more entrepreneurial, because you in essence, you eat what you kill. I mean, you're on your own bottom. You get your own revenue, and you have to live with it. That may be a model to encourage greater efficiency, which we'll see. It's not new. There are several universities that are on this, but and there have been some perverse incentives caused by it as well. And finally, there have been proposals to shift state funding entirely into a student aid approach. Take the appropriations away, turn it all into state student aid on a need basis. Archibald and Feldman, who have a very interesting book out called Why Does College Cost So Much, advocate that in their book. So there are a lot of interesting ideas floating around out there. Which ones will finally surface and get latched onto, I don't know. If I could predict that, again, I'd be a lot richer than I am. So, but they're out there, the ideas are out there, and I think the setting is right for some of these to take root and grow. But overarching this whole conversation is what I'm calling today the specter of Baumel's cost disease. Do you all know what the cost disease is? Does anybody know what the cost disease is? No kidding. Oh, I thought everybody knew what. Cost disease was something that two economists, Baumel and Bowen, Bill Bowen, former president of Princeton, discovered when in the 1960s they did a study on the economics of the performing arts. The issue was, why do opera companies, symphonies, just always face budget problems, and right now symphony orchestras around the country are having horrible troubles. And their conclusion is this is a handicraft activity. You can't do, if you want to hear a live string quartet performance, you can't do it with 3 players, and you can't speed them up and do it in 20 minutes instead of 30 minutes. So there's no productivity gain. It's always going to take 4 people 35 minutes to do a string quartet. And yet the salaries of people who play those instruments routinely go up because of income gains and productivity gains in the other parts of the economy, which sort of lifts all salaries. And so their argument was higher education is like that. It's a handicraft industry. It doesn't have productivity gains available to it. How I teach today is just about the same way I taught 40 years ago, and I'm no more productive in some ways than I was 40 years ago. And yet my salary is considerably higher. So the unit cost of production inexorably goes up faster than incomes and faster than inflation. And he's applied that to the medical sector and to the education sector. And it's a pretty powerful argument. I mean, this Archibald Feldman book lays it out and endorses it. And if that's true, if we are the kind of activity that all this talk about technology and everything really doesn't promise true changes in the educational production process, then we're stuck with a problem that we've got to figure out how to sell to the rest of the public. Baumel's answer is people's incomes go up because other parts of the economy are generating productivity. Their incomes go up, our prices go up, but they've got the money to pay for it. So quit your whining is kind of the argument. I'm not sure in this last decade that works too well. And then there's the ever-present issue of educational quality. Well, let me wrap up briefly with two very quick comments on governance. The fiscal pressures we're talking about are clearly increasing stress on board governance and on the very notion of shared governance with faculty. Shared governance produces very slow change, almost by design, I think, and that frustrates trustees now more than ever. They want to see, most trustees come from the business community, and they live in a dynamic, there was a wonderful term coined in the midst of all this stuff at UVA this summer, strategic dynamism. That's what we were supposed to do, is we were supposed to generate strategic dynamism. These business terms just slay me. I don't know, they come up with all these code words that sort of mean something, but I can't figure it out. Anyway, so the trustees, many of them are frustrated because we aren't adapting and doing things. And one thing that came clear to me, I used to be on the board at Goucher College, which is in fine shape, a lovely college in the outskirts of Baltimore. And I was invited there about a month ago by the president and a key trustee who was an investment banker, venture capitalist. And this trustee, who's a good person and all heart's in the right place, is all involved with these educational for-profit entities that are floating around the periphery of higher education, things like Straighter Line and Inside Track. I mean, there are a lot of little companies that are out there that people are investing in that do something involving higher education. And he's convinced now, in an odd way, that he knows more about the future of higher education, which he sees somehow captured in all these technological developments, than the inmates who are running the institution. And so all of a sudden, trustees, I think, and that's what happened at UVA, at least in part, our trustees became obsessed with the notion that Stanford and Harvard and MIT were doing all these things online, and we weren't jumping on the bandwagon quite as fast as they thought we should, and they viewed the president as the obstacle. And but the insight I got was that it's, trustees have typically been brought up with the notion that they should have noses in and fingers out. They should be aware of what's going on, asking hard questions, but not trying to run the place. And now, I think as a number of them get sophisticated about some of these technology developments, and they're all reading Clayton Christensen. I mean, that's almost become the Bible. They are really looking at the rest of us as if we're just got our head in the sand, and they know more now than we do. And I think that's going to pose growing problems for management. I think presidents are going to confront, I hope not as dramatically as we did at Virginia, but they're going to confront trustees that are trying to push us in ways we're maybe not ready to be pushed. It's just one more issue to be dealt with. The whole process of selection of boards of public boards is an issue. I don't know how yours are selected in Florida. In ours, they're purely gubernatorial picks. The governor typically puts his major campaign supporters, financial supporters on boards. So that's the payoff, quid pro quo. These people turn over fairly quickly. They never really learn the institution. They're really, by comparison to most good private college and university boards, they're far, far less effective and less good stewards of the institution. And that's another horrible issue, I think, that higher education struggles with. The experience at UVA this summer, to our amazement, though, suggests that sometimes these precipitous actions by a board acting out their frustrations with the slow pace of change can be extremely damaging and ill-advised. And I'm running out of time, so I won't say any more about that, but fascinating experience. I think it'll become a great case study in governance. And if you had asked any of us, number one, would this have happened? We'd have been shocked. Number two, would it be reversed? We'd have never bet a nickel on the possibility of that. It was a wonderful example of an institution rising up and taking back its central charge from a kind of a misguided board. We actually, the Faculty Senate voted no confidence in the Board of Visitors. And I'm not sure that happens very often, but we did it. And in fact, we haven't lifted it yet. So, just to conclude, rising financial stress can easily translate almost automatically into increased tension in governance, and that becomes yet one more challenge that our institutions are going to have to confront. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I went on so long, but I enjoyed it. Shocked you into stunned silence. That typically happens. Yeah, Marcy. I can show you the table in the book. I mean, it would, if you took the goal, I think that one, there are two, there's the Lumina and the Obama goal, and I think the 8.2 comes out of the Obama goal, which is actually the more aggressive, and it takes a look at the, it starts with his goal is to get to the top of the OECD league tables, so he starts with that as the base, and then you have to figure out what you think those countries are going to do year by year, and then what it would take for us to leapfrog back to the top. So it is, I think it's a real number if you buy the assumptions, and it's. Well, I'm not clear. I'm having trouble connecting your issue about trust with actually being able to get people in. I mean, if they won't trust us to do that? Oh, I see what you mean. Oh. Well, I think I don't think people are, most of the polls in the National Center, Pat Callan's group has done a lot of public opinion polling over the years. Every year, more and more families say higher education is essential and it's vital. And I don't think they are, I mean, there's quibbling about whether we're really doing a good job, whether students are really learning and working as hard as they used to, and there are all these things, which my guess is you probably could find that in every generation going back. I mean, nobody ever did as well as the preceding generation in some minds. But I don't think the loss is in the value of getting college degrees. I think that the lost trust is that we're really running the shop as intelligently as we should, that we're making the adjustments we should, that we're being efficient, that we're being accountable. I think they're not willing to just accept our say-so that we're doing the best we can. But I don't think they're questioning the underlying product as much.
One more question?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a widely held view. I mean, in Virginia, the university presidents several years ago sort of gave up on the state, in essence. Although I mind you, I mean, with including our hospital, UVA is a $2.4 billion enterprise. The state gives us, I think, right now, a little over 100 million, which seems like pocket change. On the other hand, it's unrestricted, in our case anyway, it's unrestricted funds, and to replace that would require 20 times that amount in endowment, and we're not going to find that in an unrestricted form. So that's high-powered money, and I think one of the loose talk about privatization that you hear more and more, I think discounts the fact that some of that state support, even if it's modest and less than it used to be, is pretty powerful money, and you'd struggle hard to replace it. And not every institution can replace it with tuition dollars, because as you do that, you're going to have to put in more aid, and the net revenue coming out of that may not be that great. So I think it's a real dilemma. On your first point, I couldn't agree with you more on these public board, private board differences. I was president of a private college, so I had a private college board, and I've served on 2 private college boards subsequently. And we're real stewards. I mean, we are, number one, we're self-selected, and we care about the place, and we are there to support it, and we're not there to hurt it. And in my observations in Virginia, we have had a variety of very good and very bad trustees, and the bad ones are there as watchdogs for the governor. If the governor's hostile, they're there to keep us in line, and they're not there necessarily to help. And they become part of the problem. I mean, they make it hard to run the place when you've got people second guessing you constantly. Right now, our board is in that mode. They're second guessing everybody. Every vice president gets raked over the coals. It's not a healthy situation. And yet it's a hard one to change. I mean, it's hard to get the governor to give up one of the prime payoffs he's got for campaign supporters. And I suppose there's a more elevated view of that concept in principle, if not in practice. But it's hard to advance the argument that we should have constituency-based boards and a certain number of self-selected. There may be some examples out there. I think there are a few in the public sector where those differentiated boards exist, but they're still not that common, I think, and I think it's a serious issue.
Thank you again.
Oh, thank you.
We have a very distinguished panel to address some of the issues that have been raised in the talks earlier this morning. I will briefly introduce them, but you'll be able to find most of the information in the program. But we're delighted to have Eric Ness from the University of Georgia joining us, an assistant professor of higher ed at the University of Georgia, David Tanberg, who is in the higher ed program here at FSU, and David Coburn at the end of the table. And I apologize to him. Most of the bio got chopped off, and the information in the program is incomplete and from the earlier years of his career. But he has also served in the Florida legislature in both houses as budget directors and as chief of staff. He comes with lifelong understanding and deep leadership involvement in higher education policymaking in the state of Florida. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to come to the podium and speak for about 10 minutes, giving some additional responses to and their own insights on the comments made this morning, and on the issues that were raised by our speakers. And we'll start with Eric Ness.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you for the opportunity to be here with you this morning, and the opportunity to share a bit about some of the research that I am conducting on research utilization, and also to comment some on Dr. Brenneman's keynote address from earlier this morning. So my recent strand of research tends to focus on research utilization, or how policymakers, to what extent policymakers rely on research and other sources of information in the policymaking process. And you might ask, so what do I mean by this? And some of the earlier work on this topic tends to focus on 3 different ways in which policymakers use research information. One is to think about instrumental use, or the direct use of information. And so one example for that might be, as Dr. Brenneman suggested, the idea of using of having all the state resources go directly to students in the form of need-based aid. So it could be that policymakers would hear that idea, read the research behind the idea, and directly propose a bill or vote for a bill to implement that policy, right? That's an example of instrumental use. Another type of use would be the conceptual or enlightenment function of research. So this might be that over time, policymakers come to appreciate certain perspectives based on their exposure to research and other information by hearing testimony over time, by coming to events such as this, by reading policy briefs or having interest groups advise them on certain policies. And though it may not inform a direct vote on an issue, that over time they become sympathetic, they become more understanding of a certain perspective that informs their policymaking activity. The final way in which Carol Weiss is the author of this, pointed out that information is used is the political or tactical use. And I mean that more descriptively or not pejoratively, but that information can be used to gain support for a certain policy. And rather than guide how a policymaker might vote, they may understand what program they support and look for information to support that and use it to gain support. And so cynically, I guess, we might focus on, when I said research utilization, I saw some smirks around the room. And so cynically, we might say, well, the political or tactical use seems to be what we see occurring, right? That there is use of information to drive, to simply gain support for a previously held position. But there seems to be evidence that the conceptual and enlightenment function may be underappreciated, and that in the early stages of the agenda of the policy process, that it indeed, whether they be academics or other policy think tanks, such as Dr. Brenneman mentioned, may serve a priming function, may frame the debate in a way that is somewhat masked by the political use later on in the process. And so what are the challenges to research utilization? And one of these, Robert Birnbaum, a preeminent higher education researcher and leader, had a provocative title called "Policymakers Are from Mars, Policy Scholars Are from Venus," in the early 2000s. And so the idea was that, that these are 2 separate communities, each with their own language and norms. I wanted to read an excerpt from, I conducted a study last summer in 3 states, and I'll tell you a bit more about them: Tennessee, which Dr. Brenneman mentioned, Pennsylvania, and Kansas. And this is from one of the respondents in Pennsylvania. I want you to see if this resonates with you. He says, "Well, I say, first of all, you guys pick the issues you're interested in rather than what the legislators or policymakers are interested in. Secondly, your timing is largely irrelevant to the decision-making process in states. Thirdly, when you do produce a report, it's likely to be in a language and a format that guarantees no legislators are going to read it. That's the problem with research." He said earlier that research is a dirty word in Pennsylvania. This is one person's perspective, but there was some consensus behind that in Pennsylvania. And so the challenge, perhaps, to research use lies in the supply of research. So goes one set of arguments, that the academics, the researchers, are producing producing research that is irrelevant in these three ways. I think conceptually we may understand less the demand for research, right? And so what exactly are legislators interested, what type of information are they interested in receiving? And so one way in which that is bridged is through these intermediary organizations or boundary spanning organizations. And Dr. Brenneman mentioned a few of these. The National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education serves as an intermediary, produces the measuring up report for the most recent decade that was meant to spark conversation and serve as a bridge between academics, researchers who ran a rigorous model, and presented it, the primary audience was policymakers. Regional compacts, such as the SREB, has had a long-standing mission in serving as this intermediary. In fact, their membership is comprised of both elected officials and leaders of higher education systems. And state agencies within states that vary, as Dr. Brenneman mentioned, in terms of their formal authority, but these too can serve as bridging this policy and research divide. And so I thought that I would just briefly mention a few of the preliminary findings from this 3-state study that may give some more context to the ways in which research is used in the states. And I'll start with Tennessee, which was the first state that I'm aware of to, it's been coined performance funding 2.0, is the way it's been talked about in some circles. The Tennessee folks are very adamant that theirs, as Dean Brenneman suggested, is an outcomes-based formula. And the idea there was, in some ways, incubated in the coordinating board at Tennessee and the staff there. And in the later stages of the process, there was an organization, Complete College America, that many of you may be familiar with, that is funded heavily by the Lumina Foundation and Gates Foundation, I believe, as well. And so part of the conversation is, what role do intermediaries have in bridging this divide? And is there competition among intermediaries? And in Tennessee, from the majority of the respondents' perspective, there was a bit of competition between what the Complete College America agency wanted and what the Tennessee Coordinating Board folks were interested in, and found that from the perspective of elected officials and of folks in higher education, that it was their local state agency that seemed to best bridge the divide and create the model that was appropriate for the unique context of Tennessee, just as all states have unique context. The other idea that was proposed is that there may be another way in which information spreads, in which this divide is brokered, and that is the flattening of information sources, and what one respondent described as the simple Googling process, right? And so the Tennessee Higher Education Commission has been invited to give talks about their outcomes-based formula in more than half of the states, and in 6 or 7 different foreign countries. And the idea is that this is facilitated by simply hearing about it, reading about it in the Chronicle of Higher Education, and Googling, Tennessee. I suspect there's also networks at play here as well. And that was one of the findings from the Kansas study, was that there were networks of, I mentioned some of the networks related to higher education. There's also networks for the legislators and governors, the National Governors Association, the Regional Governors Associations, the National Conference of State Legislatures, and more recently, the American Legislative Exchange Council. In Kansas, one of the sources of information that they highlighted was what is seen now as a more ideologically based think tank, or Dr. Brenneman mentioned the Heritage Foundation and some of the national agendas that seem to be aligned with more a political or ideological perspective. And there's evidence that that's occurring at the state level as well, not just with ALEC, which is seen as kind of a rival networking function for state legislators, but also within states. They're creating think tanks that are having, according to these respondents, a significant impact on both the supply of information and the type of and the information that policymakers are increasingly relying on. And then I don't want to end on a well, it's a descriptive note. I won't say it's a bad note. As Dean Driscoll mentioned, in Pennsylvania, they cut spending by 50% over the last few years for higher education. And I stated this example here about the 2 communities divide in Pennsylvania. And according to our interviews there, when asked what describes the policymaking process or how research is utilized, a common response is it's all political. Or Pennsylvania is a no-policy state when it comes to higher education. And one of the reasons that some of our respondents pointed to was structural. Pennsylvania has a relatively weak higher education governance structure. That's a planning agency that has very little formal authority. Pennsylvania is one of only 3 states that's not a member of a regional compact, not SREB or Midwest Higher Education Compact, and for that reason, and there's also some evidence that the political structure, the legislature is more professionalized, the governor has strong powers, that tends to drive the use of information and research in the policymaking process. So I mentioned these remarks. My interest in this is both conceptual. I think we need to have a better understanding of how we might understand the policy process. I think it may also have some practical impact for those who may be interested in informing the policy process. So I'll look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
David Tamberg, one of our own.
It's a wobbly podium is what it is. It's nice to be here. I'm going to attempt to draw together some of the comments that we've heard from Dr. Brenneman, from our president, and from Dr. Ness. I was particularly interested in the presentation by Dr. Brenneman on his book, which if you've not read it, I highly recommend it for a number of reasons. But one reason in particular, there's an organization in Boulder, Colorado called SHEO, the State Higher Education Executive Officers, and so it's a national association of each state's ranking higher education officials, so the person that sits at the top of the governance structure or the state governing board. And Paul Lingenfelter is the president of that organization, and he's long advocated the idea that a state ought to rationalize its approach to finance and to policy, and that those two approaches ought to be unified towards a number of declared goals. However, largely, the appropriation process follows its own logic, right? Responding to the political and economic winds and the policy process. Do we follow a need-based financial aid approach, or do we go with merit aid, or any of the other number of factors that Dr. Brenneman brought up? Happens through an entirely different process, all of which relates to what Dr. Ness talked about, and the use of information, the use of research, and is it utilized, how is it utilized, if it is. In the 1990s, there was a significant trend within public policy and public administration, and it found its way into higher education public policy also. And if you remember, there was the Reinventing Government movement, which fostered the new accountability movement in higher education. Central to this in higher education was the idea of performance funding, right? And that has been brought up by each of the speakers so far as a policy worthy of consideration. Well, it took off like wildfire in the 1990s, and we had upwards of 30 states, perhaps 20 to 30 states, depending on who's counting, that had implemented this approach. Recessions, disenchantment with the performance funding programs, and whatnot led to a significant decline in the number of institutions or states that have implemented performance funding as a way of driving a portion of their appropriations out to colleges and universities. This is that outcomes-based funding that Dr. Brenneman talked about. Well, recently, we've seen a rather significant and dramatic return to the idea of performance funding. That's what Dr. Ness referred to as performance funding 2.0. What's fascinating about this, the first emergence of this approach and now the return, is that in the empirical literature, there is absolutely no evidence that it actually improves outcomes. There is some evidence that it impacts, to a small extent, internal institutional financing decisions. There was Robofsky out from the University of Oklahoma showed that you see a small increase in spending within research universities on the academic side of the institution, and a slight decrease in spending on the research portion of the university, which is predictable when most of these, the primary indicators are graduation rates, et cetera, and so the theory being that if you fund the academic side, you may see some improvement there. However, no empirical evidence that those improvements actually happen as a result of performance funding. Well, nevertheless, a good chunk of really intelligent, highly informed, highly experienced individuals continue to push the idea of performance funding as an antidote, as an approach. And there's three hypotheses that they've generated that explain why they continue to push it, even though as of yet we have no evidence that it works. Because, and if you think about it, it makes some sense. It should work. We are a market-based country. We believe in incentives. In an era of increasingly scarce resources, financial incentives should be particularly effective, right? So theoretically, performance funding should be a very effective way of driving institutional actions towards outcomes that states are interested in. And so three ideas as to why the empirical evidence has not supported what theoretically ought to work. One is that the theoretical research, the empirical research is fundamentally flawed. One of the major criticisms of the research is that as of yet, you have to track these things over time as states adopt, abandon this state, and as of yet, it's very hard to get good data on when states actually had performance funding, when they abandoned it, when they had it but yet didn't fund it, when they funded it yet it was something different. And so scholars have had a hard time tracking that, because sometimes it was legislatively dictated, so it was in statute. Other times it was dictated by the system office or the coordinating board, and so it wasn't in statute. Hard data to collect. And so one theory is that the data is flawed, therefore, understandably, we find no effect. The second is that the programs, by and large, didn't exist long enough, or a significant portion, they were implemented, they hit hard financial times, they were ignored or formally shut down. And so there's a length hypothesis. Well, if they existed longer, we'd be able to see the effects, because we know things don't change quickly anywhere, but particularly in higher education. So it takes time for the institution to develop suitable strategies to respond to the incentives, and then it takes time for those changes to have the impact that it's needed to be able to gauge, to have to see things change in the outcomes. We work on 4-year cycles of students. So there was the length hypothesis. The third is that fundamentally these programs were just not designed well. That the performance funding programs of the 1990s were influenced too much by politics, watered down by institutional lobbying, and just were not well informed to begin with. A collaborator and I decided that we would test the three hypotheses. So we spent months working with all sorts of people around the country, trying to identify exactly when a state implemented performance funding, at what time was it funded, when was it defunded, when was it shut down. And I won't go into all the steps we took to validate our data. So that would address problem number 2, and then we used a quasi-experimental research design, yada, 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 but a rigorous test of this than what has been done in the past. And then second, we identified, so we ran all sorts of statistics and regressions on that, and then we looked at, okay, what states kept their program for and now I'm blanking, was it 5 or 7 years, but we said the longer period, at least 5 or 7 years, if not beyond. So that would, I think it was 7 years that we used as our cutoff. So that would test hypothesis number 2. And then third, as Eric referenced, there's the idea of performance funding 2.0. And performance funding 2.0 has fundamentally been driven by places like Complete College America, NCHEMS, and others have people there that have really thought through performance funding. How can we design it as to correct for the deficiencies of the past programs and do it in a better way? This really started in the mid-2000s. And so then we tested, we only included those states that had the more quality programs. And come to find out that when you include them all, so the first regression, we got all the good data, you actually do find a significant, modest increase in completions when a state implements performance funding. The size of that effect goes up when you isolate only those states that have had it for at least 7 years. The size of the effect goes up even higher when you isolate only the performance funding 2.0 states. So in fact, according to our research, and you guys can read it and then critique it and say it's full of crap if you want, but according to our attempt, and I'm happy to talk about the methods during question and answer if you like, performance funding, having some sort of incentive, does change something. What the institutions are doing, we have absolutely no idea. No idea what they're doing. There's the idea of perverse incentives, right? Are they watering down quality? Are they changing their admittance practices? Are they just doing a better job of reporting the data? So actually there are no real new students, they're just counting them more carefully, right? Any number of things. Or are they fundamentally adjusting their practices and allocation of resources in such a way that you're seeing real positive outcomes? That much we don't know. And those are the real big questions. The size of the effect, you're talking of anywhere a few additional 100 students to a few thousand additional students, depending on the state, the program, and which of the tests we're talking about. Those are real numbers. It doesn't get us to Obama's goal, but we're seeing differences. The fact that, or the point that I want to leave you is that these policies do a few things. One, performance funding does in fact force states to match policy to finance to goals, right? By its very nature, it rationalizes the process to a certain extent. Two, decisions by policymakers have real impact. For better or for worse, they impact things. We interviewed a few institutional leaders and say, heck yeah, we paid attention, you know? Of course we did. We're talking about our bottom line here. How they reacted is something that we need to figure out. And as policymakers, as they entertain these ideas, it behooves them to realize, yeah, this impacts the institutions. They pay attention, which means we ought to pay attention and design systems, hopefully, that result in the kind of outcomes, real outcomes, that we care about. I'll leave it there as we have additional speakers, but I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A time.
Thank you. And our final panelist, David Coburn, who has been involved very intimately as a participant and an advisor to state policymakers in Florida.
Thank you. Eric, I guess I would say greetings from Mars. I think that guy you were quoting about research in Pennsylvania probably was originally from Florida, in my experience anyway. And then I guess the third suggestion I would make to you is if you want the people in Pennsylvania to feel better about their governance structure, bring them down here for a while. Seriously. So I wanted to talk about a couple of terms to start with. liberal arts and liberal arts degrees. Now, I worked for the legislature for almost 35 years, and I remain astonished at how difficult it is to convince people that it is hard to get a bunch of conservative legislators, most of whom, at least in Florida, are Republicans, to get excited about funding liberal arts degrees. Now, you talk about STEM and they light up, notwithstanding the fact that most of them don't know what that stands for. But there is a fundamental dichotomy there that people don't really understand. There's a problem. If you look at what's happened to the budget of the state university system, and it's been discussed by the president, since 08-09, general revenue to the state university system has gone down by over 25%. That's over $500 million. Okay? Overall, general revenue support to the entire higher ed system, including all systems, has decreased by less than half that. So there's a message there. They're treating universities differently. What I found over the years is they love their school. They love Florida, or they love Florida State, they love USF, but they don't like universities. It's interesting to deal with. Now, they'll fund community colleges, and they'll fund work for them, but they don't want to fund universities. Now, they'll fund because they love their school. They'll fund a project. If you go to them and you want a building or you want a program for your school, they'll go out of their way to handle that. But they don't want to increase base funding for the system. It's an interesting dilemma from a policy perspective, but more so from a political one. We had one golden age of funding for the university system, in my experience over 34 years, in the late 70s to mid 80s in the House of Florida only, the Florida House of Representatives. There was a concerted effort to fund universities. Now, that was basically because you had a leadership over there that wanted to fund the University of Florida. But the rest of the system got the benefit of that. Legislators are trapped in kind of a sophisticated trap. You alluded to it in the sense that Medicaid has eaten a lot of the budget that I think would have gone to universities in some scenarios. But they're trapped by other things. They're trapped by prison costs, and they're trapped by K-12 costs. And all of these things have either a constitutional basis, in other words, there's an adequacy provision for funding K-12 in the state constitution. There are federal constitutional requirements about funding prisons. Medicaid is driven, as he said, by federal mandates and incredible funding incentives. Then there's another issue that really hasn't been discussed, and that's ballot initiatives. And this is happening all over the country. Okay? In Florida, we've had class size reduction in K-12, extremely expensive. We've had universal pre-K, extremely expensive. You've had tobacco education. You've had a new version of K-12 adequacy put into the Constitution, which is now in front of the state Supreme Court in a very important case, which is going to drive K-12 funding up, potentially, at the expense of, guess what? Because there are no constraints of that nature for funding higher education. And as he said, you always have tuition, which has gone up 70% since 08-09. So that's the kind of box in which they find themselves in terms of funding the state university system. But as I said, they treat the other systems different. Some other thoughts that have been triggered off, I think, the capacity supply issue. My observation of what's going on now is that that's going to be addressed by politicians through online education. I see what has happened in K-12 with virtual education beginning to happen at the higher ed level. The think tanks, it's the darling concept of the think tanks right now. Lobbyists are beginning to be hired. I happen to know that the Western governors are looking for lobbyists in Florida. And money is beginning to flow, campaign money is beginning to flow from the private concerns that are doing this. So I think that that is going to happen in a big way, probably sooner rather than later. The other observation I would make that I think really affects the funding situation and the accountability situation is that legislators paint with a very broad brush. And I think that it's difficult to get them to understand that revenue solutions and accountability solutions that may work well for regional institutions or state colleges or community colleges are not necessarily going to work well for major research universities. And that is a problem for schools like Florida and Florida State. And we have to figure out a way to address that in order to inform them so that we can help resolve that dilemma. So I'll leave you with those thoughts.